This is the Mindset Athlete Podcast, and I'm your host, James Roberts. I'm a two-time Paralympian and owner of James Robert Fitness, which is an online training, nutrition, and mindset coaching business. First of all, I'd like to thank Lauren Williams for suggesting this quote to the show. An athlete is a mindset. It's how you prepare, think, and execute. Not because of some elite status or physical stature. Anybody can be an athlete. By Chris Harth. And each week on the Mindset Athlete, we like to bring you inspirational athletes, a message, or experts talking about human optimization to teach you how to change your perception of your mindset and become 1% better. And on today's show, I've got Ron Kaiser. He is a licensed psychologist in Philadelphia, where he's in private practice and also serves consulting psychologist to the Jefferson Headache Center at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. In addition to serving on staff at both Jefferson and Methodist Hospitals, Dr. Kaiser is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Neurology at Jefferson Medical College. And not forgetting, he is also the author of the bestselling book, Rejuvenaging, The Art and Science of Growing Older with Enthusiasm. So welcome onto the show, Ron.
Thank you. Nice to be with you, James.
So before we delve into today's topic, Ron, can you give a little bit of a gem, something the audience don't know about you that I may have missed out from your initial introduction?
Well, some people are sometimes surprised to know that I'm 81 years old. I continue to work full-time. I also operate a website and podcast. I go to the gym at least 3 times a week, plus a yoga class, which it's a man yoga class, so you don't have to be real flexible for it. I don't take any medications unless I'm sick. And I really believe that it's very, very important to maintain a good activity level throughout the lifespan, because that's the way to avoid preventable diseases, illnesses, maintain your body tone, and your mind as healthy as possible.
And if we come from that basis, Ron, in terms of when I will hear people of the elder generation say, I can't change myself. I'm resigned to the fact that I'm going to grow old gracefully. Why do people act in that certain way and kind of, to a certain extent, give up?
I think part of it is kind of the role modeling. You know, it's we're now living much longer than at any other point in history. But yet many of us grew up when the role models were people who, if they lived to the mid-60s, if they lived a year or two past retirement, it was almost like they'd won the lottery, and therefore that, their reward was just lying around. Now, people didn't realize at that time that the taking it too easy actually contributed to their decline. But also, again, the longer lifespan is really pretty significant. And if you retire, say, at age 60 or 65, you may be living in reasonably good health for another few decades. And the reality is that if the best you've got to show for yourself is to every day watch TV, lie around, wait for lunch, and then wait for dinner, things of that nature, that builds up a really negative orientation in yourself, and it becomes a whole lot easier to do nothing. I mean, many of us, for example, I rarely miss work because of illness, but every once in a while I may get a virus that puts me down for 3 or 4 days. It's a lot harder once you've been lying around for 3 or 4 days to, aside from what the illness did to your body, but also emotionally, it becomes easier to do nothing than to do something. So it's really important, I believe, for people not to get into the habit of being too sedentary.
So what keeps you going in terms of going past what is the confines of probably outside the United States, going past what is retirement age? What drives you to keep wanting to go to work every day?
For one thing, I don't feel any different than I did when I was in the more, I guess, the mid years of life. The first obvious question I ask myself is why not? Secondly, when my wife and I thought about whether I would be retiring or not, we kind of designed our lives to be in such a way that, hey, let's get the benefit of both. I enjoy working. I strongly believe that it's an important thing to maintain health and so on, but let's not deny ourselves some of the things that we might be able to do if we were retired. We've traveled more since I was age 65 than any other time in our lives. 4 years ago, we moved into the center city of Philadelphia from the suburbs, which means we get to walk everywhere. We're close to restaurants, we're close to theaters, close to athletic events. The gym is a block and a half walk. Our supermarket's about a 2-block walk. We've developed a lifestyle that basically says, what would be better if I wasn't working, and come up with nothing.
Well, in terms of that transformation from moving to the suburbs to the city, it probably encapsulates to a certain extent some paradigms between, what we would take probably in Europe and more far apart. Obviously, there's more importance towards walking as opposed to the United States and jump in the car to get everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it actually takes a different mindset. I wasn't raised in a suburb, but I was raised in a neighborhood, not in the center of the city. I lived briefly in the center of the city before I got married, but we lived in our other house for 42 years, and we didn't think much about. I pointed out in my book, for example, the fact that there were convenience stores. The dry cleaner was about 4 or 5 blocks from my house, but we just weren't oriented in the notion of, how heavy is it to pick up 5 shirts and a pair of slacks and walk back. We just weren't oriented toward it. So I really think, and this is where the Europeans have it all over us, in terms of being able to have a great deal of walkability, to think in terms of, okay, you don't buy a week's worth of groceries at one time. You buy what you can carry in both your hands. You think in terms of, if you have a car, that you don't have to drive it every place that you go. So again, I think it takes a different mindset, but it's real important to see that as a positive thing. In other words, realistically, it's healthy, it's convenient. There's lots of reasons for it to be positive. In my case, also, it's an 8-minute walk to work, which means that when I turn on the radio and hear what the traffic is like or what the weather is like, I don't have to make any modifications for it. There was, I had read years ago that they were talking about why some of our presidents and some of the leaders in other governments, why they tended to have a fairly normal lifespan or a fairly long lifespan. And they said one of the things they don't have to worry about is waiting at the gate for the plane, or they can cut through traffic, things of this. And I find kind of the same thing here too. If you can modify your life in such a way that it makes it easier, then it makes it easier to continue working. It makes it easier to go to the gym. It makes it easier to eat healthy because you can buy fresh food on a regular basis. So again, I'm a big believer in a positive mindset.
But also, Ron, why do you think, per se, from a negative perspective, that the American culture puts so much of an attachment to the car? What's that built upon?
Well, I think advertising has played a big role. In other words, I think that for many people, if you're bombarded with advertising about different kinds of cars and what they look like, then it becomes a real status symbol. So if you're paying $75,000 for a car, you want to use it. In our case, again, it spends most of its time in the garage, so that's less important. But yeah, you want to use it. You want to make sure that it doesn't look worse than your neighbors, that there's a time when it gets, the car may get corroded, it may lose its luster, and you don't want that to happen, or you don't want to keep it too long after that happens. And then when you get that kind of emphasis, then, all cars do pretty much the same thing. They get you from one place to another. So then you have to start looking at, well, what is it that would lead you to select this car? And a particular advertiser may, or an auto company may emphasize power, another may emphasize comfort, things of this nature. So once you've invested in that decision making, it really becomes a part of you. And I also would not dismiss the possibility or the factor that it's a whole lot easier to drive a mile than to walk a mile. So that if unless you're in the middle of the city where you've got a lot of heavy traffic, but it's easier, and it becomes easier. It's why the same reason, for example, that some people will, after dinner, turn on the TV, not have anything that they really want to watch in particular, and will start channel surfing and so on. It's a whole lot easier than going to the gym, but it's not a whole lot healthier.
Yeah, but all the undertones of that, Ron, is obviously convenience. But the negative side of that, and this is probably where you would agree, what detrimental effect long term will that not only have on the mental health, but obviously your physical health, doing that repeated state of convenience, taking the shortcut option I will use for this example, and thinking of it short term, as opposed to looking at you using the example of driving a mile as opposed to walking it. Well, okay, in the short term, that doesn't really do anything. But if you look at the bigger picture, that's going to become a massive problem.
Absolutely. And it's always more difficult to sell prevention than it is to treat a disease or illness. And I think many of us in the medical and psychological field are at least share responsibility for this, because we've been emphasizing disease. If you come there with and you're depressed, as a psychologist, at one point I would consider my job done if the person is feeling better. I didn't take them to the next step to thriving, which is what I want to do now. And in essence, to kind of see myself as more like a personal trainer at the gym. You don't have to be overweight, out of shape to go to the gym, but you want to be able to become the best version of yourself. So I think that it's getting past some of the old thinking is really important. Second, I think people don't appreciate not only is the impact physically and mentally in terms of mood, but there are also some very important brain changes that are taking place. There is a part of neuroscience is the study of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and repair itself and so on. There was a time that we thought that about age 30, you kind of maxed out in terms of your brain's ability to do anything new. You could absorb new information, but not make major changes. We now know that you can make new connections, create new neural pathways, actually create new neurons, and that occurs throughout the lifespan. And I think it becomes very important. I see it as kind of the equivalent of saving money for retirement, that a lot of people don't think about saving money for retirement because they're not close to it. And then when they get close to it, then they have to start worrying about running out of money. I think in this case, it's the same type of situation. People sometimes don't pay attention to diet, exercise, staying involved with other people. All these things then build to, well, what happens if you reach retirement age and your health isn't enjoyable, if you don't have friends or a wide group of friends, or you move to another area and you have to start over and you don't have those same kinds of skills and connections? What happens if you don't stay active intellectually? So I think that we have to move toward the notion that, hey, this is a lifelong process, that people who start early, who develop good habits, and there's really good science to identify the fact that it happens in three main areas, that if you can develop good habits in the health and fitness area, in the intellectual functioning area, and in the social involvement areas, that the odds are much, much better that you're going to have healthier older years in every way than if you don't.
But would you not argue that those skills you can still, to a certain extent, look at it, those that it can be very much, how I'm going to word this, acquire, even if you say you're not necessarily not very good at one facet or the other in your earlier years, is looking at this. I think people do get fixated on, I'm only very good at this. So as I grow older, as you said, this way of thinking is this. It only can be this way. I can't deviate off this path. So I have to confide to what this thought process, my thought process is. But I think if you had an open-mindedness that you can shift and probably treat the brain as if it was like no other muscle in your body that it can change, I think people would have a different outlook. Okay, you can't change everybody's way of thinking, but it would go in a more positive direction.
Absolutely. Change is uncomfortable, but there's a difference between being uncomfortable and being impossible. In my book, for example, I identified 71 specific behaviors broken down into 7 keys of things that people can do to make changes in any area of their lives. I mean, certainly of the 71 behaviors, almost everybody is doing some of them already. But the things that are new, I mean, this is recognized just generally. I mean, colleges and universities now offer reduced fee or free courses for seniors. The gym that I belong to offers free memberships for people past a certain age. There's a lot of encouragement to make some of these kinds of changes. If you have more time on your hands, you can do more volunteering. And again, some of this is uncomfortable, but change is something that's really always been necessary in order for the species to survive and grow. And we've kind of got an obligation, I think, to be the best version of ourselves for as long as we can.
And Ron, out of the 71 tips that you recommend in your book, what would be the top 5, and this is going to test you now, be some of the changes you think people may have not thought about doing? Like some really, not controversial, but kind of something different.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, I think it's not necessarily important that it be really dramatic, dangerous, things of that nature. I think that change, if you're moving in the right direction, then that's a real positive thing. It's hard to be moving forward. It's hard to be active and be depressed at the same time, for one thing. But one of the things that I think a lot of people who don't recognize is how much benefit they get from doing good for other people. So volunteering, particularly for somebody who is kind of socially shy or uncomfortable, is a really positive thing on a lot of levels. One is, there's research to demonstrate that there is a thing called a helper's high, that you actually benefit as much, or in some studies more, than the person that you're helping. Secondly, it helps somebody who's perhaps more socially awkward to be in a position where it's not like sitting around a room or a bar and trying to make conversation. There's an actual task to be done. So that's one of the things that I encourage. Second thing is that I encourage people to make sure that they are keeping their brain active, and that I encourage either taking a class to build on their own knowledge and or to learn a new skill. But the other thing a lot of people don't realize is they may have some real skills to impart to others. A lot of people who are in the advanced age have been mentors to other people on their job and so on. So being able to look for opportunities to teach, or even write kind of a memoir type thing for their children or grandchildren is a really positive thing. Another in the health and fitness area is to learn how to discipline yourself with respect to eating. And for a lot of people, this seems really tough. So I like people to be aware of the fact that when you try and change habits, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be easy. But for example, people will tell me, if I'm working with them about a diet, geez, if I don't eat between meals, I'll get hungry. Yeah. So there's an alternative to eating, and that's to stay hungry. You usually don't create, unless there is some particular blood sugar illness or something like that, you usually don't create a lot of problems by not eating between meals. So staying hungry, and then particularly for those of us who have downsized over time, this may be a little more challenging because our kitchen is right next to other rooms, as opposed to in a larger house, we'd have to go there. So I encourage people, if they're taking any snacks, when they've taken what they're going to take, wrap it up, put it back in the cupboard or in the refrigerator or whatever it is. So they have to mindfully kind of go back and take something else. And that discourages a lot of people. And when I couple that with, you only eat in rooms that are designed for eating, and which doesn't mean where you're watching TV, that's not designed for eating. That tends to limit things a whole lot. And the other that I think people find much more difficult because they just haven't been trained in that way, unless they've been gym rats kind of much of their lives. And that's to really begin to structure in exercise times so that the default is that they're going to be active. In other words, and it doesn't have to be heavy exercise. Again, it might be taking a 20-minute walk at the start. But if I know that I am going to do that before I sit down for dinner, I've got to be willing to accept the fact that I'm not going to eat dinner until I do what I said I was going to do. So learning how to impose some discipline on yourself, particularly in the health and fitness area, is important, but it's also applicable to other areas. If I say that I'm going to, I've got this whole list of pleasure reading books or classics that I meant to get to all my life, but I had to do reading for work, and I didn't have time left over. Then if I say I'm going to do 20 minutes a day of reading, and it's going to be between these times, or 45 minutes, or whatever it may be, then I, if I'm going to do it before dinner, if I'm going to do it before I go to bed, whatever it may be, I have to actively say that, hey, there's something here that's more important. Otherwise, I got to do it.
But does that come from a psychological sense, and from a psychologist's point of view? Does that come down to reprogramming, setting yourself? It's not really a to-do list, but in terms of a reminder from a technological sense, does it come down to one of those two bases to be able to enact that change?
I think it's really an extension of the way that we learn. In other words, if you're an elementary school student or a high school student and you've got a certain amount of homework in your various subjects, you either are going to structure in the time to do it or take the chance that it's not going to happen. People who tend to structure in that time, will have a greater chance of using their education to get the job that they want. As we get older and those who retire and so on, your job is to take care of yourself, to make yourself the best version of yourself that you can be. And if you're saying, well, when I was in school, I really studied because I knew that I wanted to be an engineer, a lawyer, whatever it might be. But now, I don't have to be anything. But yeah, you do have to be something. You have to be the best version of yourself. And in order to do so, you need to be healthy from a physical standpoint, intellectual standpoint, and social standpoint.
But shouldn't and I'm going to coin it, my age group, be it people in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, take more headway of what you just said in terms of putting importance of themselves ahead of anything else, because those are probably people that will brush things aside, and I'll get to it at a later time because work is, how I see it, more important. I'll get round to it when I get round to it. Should that generation take more head of obviously what you say to the older population, but also where they used to be as the younger version of themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you need, there's no question that there are certain priorities that may not be as critical later on, such as a job or child rearing, various things that may be reduced in importance over time. But you always really need to get into the habit of being good to yourself and doing those things that make sense for yourself. I work with a lot of people who are in the younger age ranges or middle age, who will do, if their child needs a particular program that, either to advance academically or athletically or so on, they're there. But they don't apply it to themselves. And, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, that gyms are full of people who do manage to combine staying healthy with a job and child rearing or marital responsibilities or whatever. It's harder if you've got more responsibilities. Just like, I think it's harder to be me at my age than somebody who's retired and has all that time. But by managing it, I think I'm being, pretty good to myself. And I really, I'm a big believer in the positive mindset and in the mindset that I'm important. And I think you got to be able to see that throughout your life. And it's not always easy when you've got a boss who's very critical, or if you've been kind of brought up with criticism, to suddenly say that, hey, I'm the most important person to me, and I deserve to be really good to myself. But that's why people like me are around to help in that regard.
But do you think from that regard, Ron, that people is it a sense of a learned skill, or is it one that is, what's the opposite? That is, you've either learned it or you've been, or is it something, it's a skill that's taught? Whereas you see the importance of somebody needs to put in place something to advance, but you don't implement that for yourself. Is that a learned skill or is it a taught skill?
I think there are two things that are contributory here. First of all, it really helps if you have really good role models. Not everybody does, but it really helps because role modeling is a powerful teacher. I think the second thing is there is a lot of evidence to demonstrate that the more positive terms that you hear about yourself, whether it come from family, employer, others, the more that positive in relation to negative, that the greater chance that you're going to be more productive for your employer as well as more positive about yourself. There have been studies that show anywhere of you need a ratio of somewhere between 3 and 5 positive statements for each negative one that you hear. So I think a big part of it is kind of acquired as opposed to learned. But I think that we now have enough evidence, enough research, enough basis in science that people can learn these kinds of things either through therapy, through courses in self-improvement and self-development, which are more widespread. So the learning is a way of doing it, but I think there's no doubt that some people have a better head start if they've had good role modeling and or mentors or supervisors who are able to assess them and compliment them.
And obviously, from your title in your book, it's obviously using enthusiasm is a big proponent of that, and in terms of obviously having the right role model, the right environment, and the like. Obviously, it elicits that a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think enthusiasm is probably one of the most underrated emotions that has been studied, but I think it's really, really important. I think that you can see it in the differences between people, between how people assess different things. There are some people who just can't get enthusiastic about education. They can't imagine how somebody would choose to go to college for not just one degree, but for a master's or doctorate or something like that. There are a whole lot of people who look at me and probably you and just can't imagine, you willingly go to the gym that many times a week. But I'm enthusiastic about it. I'm enthusiastic about learning. I'm enthusiastic about meeting new people. And I just think that enthusiasm is a key at every age, but it's one of the things that can really rekindle some of the things that we're good at an older age. And I do want to emphasize, that, most of us are pretty good at all these things, but we haven't totally developed them. We're complex people who have learned how to walk, how to talk, how to read, so on. So that the notion of how to learn how to be good to yourself shouldn't be seen as something that's strange or that requires a whole different type of human being.
And my penultimate question to you, Ron, is in terms of looking at it from that basis, how would you get somebody to either challenge or change their thought process to be more enthusiastic?
That is the challenge, because first of all, that one of the things that we've learned in science is that humans have a negativity bias, that it actually goes back, centuries ago, when people were living under harsh conditions in caves and related kinds of places. They had to worry about the weather elements. They had to worry about the danger of wild beasts. They had to worry about other tribes over time, so that historically there's been this built-in negativity bias, so that now when most people are living in fairly sheltered environments that don't have to worry about some of the same things, we're more in tune with what can go wrong than what can go right. My first book that I ever wrote was an ebook called What Can Go Right, and it came from my work with patients that I would very often, when they were facing challenges, I would ask, when they were dealing with the thing, I'd say, what can go right? And that was like a stumper. People would say, I never thought of it, or I can tell you what can go wrong. But I thought it was a fairly simple question. So, that's why it's a challenge. Enthusiasm, as I said, I think it's underrated, and I think it's underdeveloped in human beings. So to tell somebody, well, get enthusiastic when your orientation is toward being negative is probably not going to work. That's why I like the notion of saying, okay, here are some activities that you should be doing. And as you get into them, let's make it a bit more challenging. If you don't like what you're doing, it's still important to do something that improves the mind or improves the body, so on. And it's pretty hard not to. Again, I keep coming back to the gym as an example and school as an example. But, if once you start finding what you like to do, things become pretty self-rewarding. And then that becomes, a source of enthusiasm. Again, we kind of started the show talking about, what I'm doing. I certainly wouldn't continue to be working as hard as I did if I wasn't enthusiastic about it. I wouldn't have written the book and tried to spread the word if I didn't think that people can feel better than they do. I've seen too many of my peers who have just allowed the course of events to determine how they're going to age, and they're the ones who aren't enthusiastic, and they're having a lot less fun. They're the ones who are more likely to complain about, hey, we've been here in this restaurant for, 10 minutes and we haven't been seated yet. Things suddenly take on real importance, that, there's a thunderstorm, they usually end, but people will focus on the weather, on how slow the service is. There's a lot more things to focus on and be enthusiastic on, and I hope that's the message I'm able to impart.
But Ron, before I let you go, in terms of this reprogramming and undertones towards where genetically, should I say, still programmed in the past, when will it come a time that we evolve and this will become less of a problem in terms of, always being gravitating back to negativity, be it that's generation old?
Yeah, great question. And I would remind you what I said about neuroplasticity, that the brain continues to change. There is evidence that the brain can change in a positive direction. There's a neuropsychologist, Rick Hansen, who has developed a whole theory around it that if you begin to actively take in the good, that you focus on not just doing what you're doing, that you finish the chapter of a book, but you really take it in and appreciate, hey, this was fun. I learned something. That you really get out in the weather and appreciate the fact that, hey, this is an enjoyable thing. Appreciate the fact that when I turn on the shower in the morning, the water usually is the right temperature. If as little as I drive nowadays, since I don't have to, if I get from one place to another and pass hundreds of cars on the way there and none of them hit me, that's a pretty good day. So, I mean, again, we very often, there are hundreds of seemingly mundane but positive things that happen in the course of the day. And I'm very confident that if, as a species, we begin to really focus on that, to take in the good, to really think in terms of what can go right, I don't know when the shift inside the average brain will go from negative to positive, but I'm confident that it will.
Excuse me. And my final question to Ron before we wrap up the episode is, if you had to summarize what we've been speaking about today into one sentence for people to take away, what would that be?
That's a little hard, but I'd say, number one, that it's very important to approach life with enthusiasm and with thinking about what can go right, and to recognize that no matter where you are in the lifespan, you can make changes in a positive direction.
So once again, Ron, thanks again for coming on the Mindset Athlete podcast.
Well, thank you, James. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm a big fan of yours and look forward to having you on my podcast.
Oh, the pleasure has been absolutely all mine. If you like this episode, please do share it with your friends, and do let Ron and I know what you thought of the episode by tagging us over on Instagram at The Mental Health Gym and at James O. Roberts 11. And again, you can do the same on Twitter and Facebook. And finally, do check out his website, thementalhealthgym.com. But not forgetting, check out his best-selling book, Rejuvenaging, The Art and Science of Growing Older with Enthusiasm. And as always, do check out my free content at fitamputee.co.uk and click on the link Free Resources. Make sure to check those links out. They will be in the description. You can find all the show notes at mindsetgame.lipsum.com under the category Psychology. So once again, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week for another episode of the Mindset Athlete podcast.